Hey everybody, welcome to the In All Things podcast. It's time to see God in everything. What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the In All Things podcast. We're back, so thanks for joining us. We've got another episode here, and hopefully it's something worth listening to. My name's Mitch, and as usual, but not always, I'm joined by Steve and Jared. Welcome back to the studio, y'all.
Welcome you back.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thanks for inviting us back.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have been here without the invite. So
yeah. Well, thanks for accepting it and showing up. And
that's what we do.
For our weekly listeners and watchers, we had to miss a week. Just had a bunch of sickness going on around here. So we're back.
And our editor was out of the country.
Yeah.
So,
that too.
So it was a good week off.
Yeah.
But
But now we're here.
Needed a break.
Yeah.
Couldn't stand it anymore.
Just couldn't
2 weeks
talk
in,
anymore.
man. We were exhausted.
I was just running out of things to
Couldn't
say.
handle it anymore. Yeah. I was like, well, I don't know what our topic is, so let's just take a break.
Yeah. How was Sunday, gentlemen? Because I was not here. First weekend trip I've had in a long time, and first ever, I think, weekend trip where I stayed 3 nights through Sunday and came back on a Monday because of a holiday weekend. So we've never done that before. So how was Sunday? Because I wasn't here.
Was it good?
It was good. I mean,
it was 2 days ago.
It was like you said, it was a weekend where some people go away because it's a Monday holiday for a lot of people. Schools are out. And a ton of people sick. Like Jared did the welcome, and he acknowledged that, hey, it's a miracle you're here because so many people are sick. Every family that I've talked to has somebody, and our family no exception. And the crowd was still pretty good attendance. And, we finished up our series on ROI, generosity, return on investment. And, it's a weird thing. Sherry's like, afterwards, how do you feel? I was like, well, I'm glad it's over because I don't enjoy talking and teaching a lot about money because I never want to give newcomers to the church the first time impression that that's what we're all about. But you got to talk about it because it's so biblical. Everything we shared, biblical principles about giving. But I feel like it went well and it's over. And I think it was a good series. Anthony did part 2 and that was great. So how did you feel about it?
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think to the generosity series topic, like that sermon on Sunday was probably the most
confrontational.
Yeah, because it was it was like the practical side, and it was
Right.
like this is you need to do this is what 10% means, this is what tithing means, this is how you do that. But like the first 2 weeks of the series, we didn't really go there. It was about kind of like the theology
Right.
and the heart behind generosity. And so
This
like
one was the
so
practical
like
one.
this is the one that people were waiting on. Like, oh man, the pastor's gonna tell us. We got to open our pocketbooks up and our wallets and our, go log into the app and the website and learn how to give and all that fun stuff. But yeah, it was good. I mean, you got to do it. It's biblical. You can't ignore biblical topics,
Right.
especially, prominent ones like that. But
And it's something people deal with every day of their lives. So
yeah,
money. So anyway, yeah.
Have you had feedback on the series as a whole? Have you heard anything?
A little bit here and there, not a ton. It's more quiet. I feel like when
it's
I'm
very
preaching.
personal. It's almost taboo.
Yeah,
Right. Like,
right.
why?
Yeah.
Why is money?
Yeah, I
taboo?
mean, I share some things that try to break the ice and, keep it lighter in moments, but, it's very confrontational to use an example of dine and dash that people do in restaurants, right? And to make that application to people that would just do that at church all the time and never think about any responsibility to give back.
I like what you said in your message about how a lot of people are sitting in this room and you're reaping the benefits of all the people that have come before you and their generosity. Like you wouldn't be here sitting in this worship center had not somebody sacrificed a ton.
A
for you
lot
to be
of
able to
people
do
sacrificed
it.
for 30 years. And that was what I think, to me, that's the bigger motivator is thinking, okay, we're in this spot, Refugee Road, and housing communities are just booming all around us. Intel's coming with thousands of jobs. We have so many people to reach, and we are setting it up for the future, for our kids, our grandkids, so that this church will be here spreading the gospel for years and seeing lives change. And that's what should motivate us to give, not out of obligation. And I think I stress that a lot. This is not a hey, I'm trying to guilt you into doing something. That's not what this is about. This is about understanding your responsibility and what, you get to do as a cheerful act and not just a obligation.
Do you do things for the students? Like, did you have a piggyback series for the students? Because I feel like for like the sake of discipline, learning this early, as early as possible is good. But like, because there's so many people that come into the church later on in life, they give their life to Christ as an adult, and then they like, oh crap, like my finances are screwed up and I don't have any way out. But if they were to have learned it earlier.
We haven't yet done a full-on series like this, but more and more in most of our series over the last couple months, this has been a piece of it. This is a generosity, giving back to the church piece, because I've had that conviction of like, where in the Bible does it say this starts when you have a full-time job or a degree, right? This is something that you're just supposed to do as a follower of Jesus. And so we've started to talk about it more and more, and it's been something I've brought up to the leaders, like, should we do a full-on, giving-ish series and generosity
it's probably all across
series?
the map, because you've got students that have no job. Their parents don't give them allowance, and then they just pay for everything. And then you have students that are like helping to support their families, because they do have a great job, like, working as a server at a restaurant, whatever, helping pay their way and their family.
Yeah. I asked my 15-year-old, I'm sorry,
no, go ahead,
son, and I said, what do you think about this? He's like, well, I listen and I'm learning it, but he's like, I don't have an income, so I didn't really know what to do with it, Yeah. So what are you going to say?
Yeah, but even without having an income per se, like, we're still, like we talked about a couple weeks ago, obligated to that way of life of giving. So, I think teaching on the mindset, on the perspective of being a part of God's church and what he's doing and how to give back, I think is something that we're going to do more in depth soon. But over the last maybe 6 months or so, we've like every series touched on it, and had some cool moments of students starting to really think about that. But I want to do a deep dive at some point.
You could have all the students give 10% of their Halloween candy next year. And, just do weird things like that.
Yeah.
I know you told us that when we did the pot of money, that you started when you were a kid. Your parents taught you that.
From like day one with Dave Ramsey, my dad was like head first diving into that stuff. And so, he ingrained all that into us as much as he could, no debt, save, have different layers of savings too, those kind of things.
But teenagers, if they get $100 paycheck for working as a server or wherever they work, it's harder. For them to give $10, they think. But then when you're making a full-time living and you're supporting a family, it doesn't get easier, right? But if you get the habit.
We did a series, I forget the name of it, but we talked about having breathing room, creating breathing room. Right. The problem is, as people's incomes grow, they pre-allocate their money. They're like, oh, when I make this much, I'm going to do this. Or, if I only had an extra $300 a month, I could afford this much more car payment or mortgage payment, instead of just not pre-allocating that money and saving it instead.
Right. Yeah,
living at the same means for a while, staying behind your income growth is a pretty big topic that I think we talked about that in a series that when we were talking about having breathing room, because that was just a principle that kind of stuck with me a lot. And I have some friends that make really good money, and I know how much they make, and I think to myself, like, how could you not afford to tithe or even be any kind of generous? But like, their mindset has always just been, I'm going to take advantage of all the money that I have now, and I'm going to spend it all now. And next year, if I make more, then I'll be able to afford this and that. But, yeah.
And a good outcome is 10 couples and singles are signed up now for the financial peace class that starts in the middle of March, and we still have room for more people, so that's awesome.
Yeah.
People are going to get that type of training.
I had somebody ask me, I mentioned it, but somebody asked me after first service, they said, is this something that like engaged couples could do? And I'm like, it's probably like one of the best things you could do as an engaged couple is get on the same page financially. But then, you don't want to get into marriage after the first month and be like, two incomes together, I think we could afford an extra car payment.
It's one of the top things couples fight about is money. So anyway,
yeah.
Well, moving on.
Today we thought it would be interesting and fun in a way to spend some time talking about, maybe the overarching theme for today is mental health and the church, and how maybe some of those two things have fought over the years or disagreed over the years, and then maybe kind of where they stand now, and maybe in the middle of all of that, where we each kind of and how we each approach these kind of conversations. I know between the three of us, there's different experiences when it comes to this stuff and ways that we feel and react when we hear about mental health and struggles in that way. And so, and also we're all full staff on church, and we represent, the body of Christ. And so there's a lot to say about how those things have been handled over the grand scheme of history and all that kind of stuff. And so we just wanted to take some time and dive into all of it. And I think it'll be pretty interesting just to kind of, for us to work out where do we stand on some of this stuff? Where is the line between Jesus and therapy and all these different conversations that we could have? And for me, this is a pretty prominent conversation for our students right now. This whole month and a half we've been doing walking through social media technology, safety and awareness. And a lot of what we've been talking about is mental health and how much of a role that kind of stuff does play in things like loneliness and anxiety and depression and things like that. So it's been something that I've kind of been sitting in a lot lately. But I think it'll be interesting for us to kind of dive into it. So let's start with the oldest one here, Jared. No, I'm kidding. So Steve, you graduated high school what year?
1988.
And
back in the 1900s.
And did you go to Liberty the next year?
Yes,
following
I
year?
did.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And you started out, you knew that you were going to go into ministry when you got to Liberty? Or
I know, and it changed in January. So I had one semester where I was going into business.
Okay.
And then in January, I felt God called me to ministry.
So you kind of switched
yeah.
majors.
But all I had was basic courses, so
yeah.
it really didn't matter.
Okay, so then by the time you got into your more church leadership classes and Bible classes and things like that, spending time with those kind of professors, and really began to learn how to do ministry full-time in church, right? Do you remember any kind of conversation about mental health or any kind of courses that you took on that kind of stuff? Or maybe just overarching, what was some of the things you felt about mental health when you were young, in college, even your first job, that kind of stuff, like anything you can remember?
Sure. I would say we did take some basic psychology classes, and they were really good, some really good professors. And of course, that's dealing with the mental health side of things. And that was probably a generic course required for everybody, not really just because I was going into ministry. So from the ministry standpoint, I don't think back then there was as much emphasis as there is now. Mm-hmm. Liberty's all over that now. But back then, I think that the church stigmatized mental illness more so. The church I grew up in, the answer, if you came to the pastor and said you were struggling with depression, was read your Bible more and pray and listen to my sermons, mm-hmm. right? And now there's sometimes people want counseling, and the counseling is like, yeah, listen to the sermon. You do what is in the sermon, you'll probably be okay. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about mental illness, and there's so many different kinds of mental illness. But it was kind of a thing. It was stigmatized. Also, there's a stigma of medicating, and there is an over-medicating that can happen in our culture today for sure, but there isn't, we forget to take care of the mental side of our being like we do our physical side, and we should obviously elevate that like has been done in society. So the church, I think, has been behind. I would just say that growing up, the way I don't remember people talking about depression, anxiety, PTSD was something I learned after 9/11. It wasn't like we really talked about these things, and these things that people were really struggling with. You just were supposed to really suppress it more than anything. And that's probably what you've heard, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, how you heard that the church was. But I was never like in a place where I felt like I was taught to make fun of it or look down upon it. It was just kind of one of those things you just didn't really know how to deal with or talk about, and you didn't think that many people really struggled. Mm. But there are more people that struggle with it than you realize.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's gotten a lot better. So I don't want to go too far into that, but I think in the last 20 years we've come a long way with the church. I think a big part of that was what happened probably more than a decade ago. One of the most prominent pastors in the country, in the world, Rick Warren's son, took his life, and his wife then has created a whole thing for churches to do better with mental illness, and that brought a lot of awareness because pastor's son, and like there was all these things. It's like, well, there's no reason for him to struggle. He grew up in this great family, and he struggled for his whole life, and then took his own life. So, I think anyway, I think I've learned a lot over the years, and I like learning from you and you. I know, Jared, you're studying a lot of this stuff now too with studying counseling. I think there's so much more to learn. I don't feel equipped, and I think the thing is we shouldn't. And I'll stop talking, but as pastors, it's like one of the things I do remember they taught me at Liberty was don't try to counsel people in areas that you're not equipped to. You're not a professional counselor. You are a pastor. So pray with them, encourage them, refer them to people who are professionals. And we probably don't have enough professional Christian counselors, because I think you can go so far in evaluating and diagnosing, and then all the worldly things about it without the God part of it. And I think that you need both. I think you need Jesus, and you need the Bible, and you need prayer, but you also need the professional help. So anyway, there's a little
All right. Well,
ramble.
that's a wrap on this episode of In All Things. Steve just summed everything up for us.
I did not.
So, we'll see you next week. No, Jared, what is some of your experience that you can remember of this conversation? And like Steve kind of alluded to, it's changing for you a little bit, right? The deeper you get into some of this world. So maybe give us a little bit of that too, but the best you can, what was it like? What did you hear about this stuff growing up, college, and then kind of where you are now?
Yeah, I think for me, it was just a topic that was almost avoided, especially early on. I don't know if it was me that was doing the avoidance, or if it was just, lack of awareness overall. But I don't remember in my early studies at Liberty, when I was there, I didn't do any. I don't think I had to take a psychology class. I don't even know if it was like I guess it wasn't a requirement. Maybe it was, and I just don't remember taking that class because I might have hated it so much. I don't know. But like just thinking about things like that weren't really even on the radar. I would say, like, for me personally, my eyes over the past 5-6 years, especially having young kids myself, have really been opened to the problems that we face with mental health, and not just that, but like society as a whole. We see the things that society is doing, the things that society tries to push on us, which are all a direct result of not having the mental health professionals that we need, having a lack of counselors, and having a lack of people, not just counselors, but people with any type of knowledge on the subject. And I think that's, kind of what Steve was saying, was like, we need more than just pastors to be able to do this. We need clinically trained people, because there's several different facets of mental health. There's actual like chemical and physical issues that people face. It's not all just like this, spiritual like things that people go through. I mean, that's part of it. That's one facet. Yeah. But like there are deficiencies that people have that we need more capable people to be able to treat. I think that's when I think of mental health, a lot of times we just think, oh, that person just, they just need to know this, or they need to learn this, or they need to, but no, like they actually struggle physically in some way in their mind. Maybe the specific part of their brain isn't fully developed. When we think about things like ADD, when we think about things like, autism, like those aren't things that can be switches that can be flipped on and off. Those are deficiencies that we have to learn to live with. And I think that's kind of that's just kind of how my opinion's been swayed over the years, thinking through that. Like, you always just look at people and think, they could just figure it out. Like, what's wrong with them? Why don't they just stop being so dumb? Or, like, why don't they just get this piece of their life together? a lot of it's not that they choose not to, it's because they actually just can't, and they need somebody to help walk them through that. So yeah, that's what I would say. And I really do think that, like, for me personally, it's been the past 5 or 6 years that's really, my eyes have been open to the issues, because like, you know, like I was saying, I mean, I don't remember any significant conversations about this 15, 20 years ago. So
like when you were in high school.
No,
it
not at
wasn't
all.
being talked about.
No. Like I didn't have it. I mean, I couldn't tell you what autism was 20 years ago, 15 years ago. Like, I don't even really know if it was as nearly as prevalent as it is today. I think that, you know, we have a lot better and concise ways of diagnosing these things now than we did then. So awareness is a lot higher. Like ADD, ADHD, when I was growing up, my mom, you know, had me tested for ADD, and, you know, of course I was given some medication for it. And like, was that just because that's what everybody was doing? You know, like every kid, you know, any kid that's struggling, we're just going to put them on ADD medicine. That was starting to come out of the woodworks in the early 2000s, 1990s, like, you know, and then college students started to get addicted to Adderall and Ritalin and all these stimulants and things like that. But yeah.
So 9 years later, you're 9 years younger than Jared. So how different do you think it has been for you?
I mean, when I think about it, I think about it in really two different buckets, like growing up in the church world and then growing up in the public school world. They really were very, very, very separate for me until I got to college, and I had multiple courses on psychology and counseling and family dynamics and all these different things, which, like you said, it made me just understand and have awareness of the problems. And not only that, but to like almost have better language for like, oh, like I've always felt this way, or like I've been in situations where I feel this, and I never had words to describe what I was feeling. And so it wasn't until college for me when things really started to, like, those worlds started to, oh, they really can interact together. But growing up, you know, like Jared said, I think it really was just like, oh, in church, we don't really talk about that stuff. Like, that's just kind of how I felt, was like, you know, high school, junior high, those times, sitting in main service or youth group, all these different things. Like, we didn't really do conversations about depression, anxiety, even then. It was very much like, yeah, like, you know, just like you said, read the Bible, pray more, whatever. But it wasn't like these in-depth, like deep dive into this stuff. But I was also going to public school at the same time, where I was seeing a lot and hearing a lot. And I mean, I had, over my 4 years being in high school, I can remember at least 3 pretty prominent students that committed suicide and things of that nature. And I just remember it was such a conversation in school of, you know, if you're struggling, we have counselors. If you have this going on, right, talk to your parents. Here's how to name this. Here's how to talk about this. Like, that was a very common thing in the school that I went to. But then it was in church, it was like that was never really addressed, at least in my, you know, high school years. And so I remember kind of having this like disconnect of, why don't we talk about those things? Like, I don't understand why we're maybe scared or don't want to go there or don't know how to go there. And I remember kind of feeling that. And then I just thought, well, I guess, you know, the church isn't for that. So, you know, we don't really talk about those things. And then for me, yeah, going to college, really beginning to talk about these things in a way of like, you don't have to brush them under a rug. You can address them. And the Bible does have ways to help, but there's also things outside of that can help you. And it really started to open my mind to those kind of things. And now being in the world of working with high school students and junior high students, the shift has been very dramatic to where it's like, pretty much every student who gets up and shares a testimony or talks about something at camp or whatever is talking about mental health in some degree, talking about things that they're struggling with, very real stories of, you know, suicide attempts and writing letters and these kinds of things that even from my experience 5, 6, 7 years ago, I wasn't seeing as much. And so it's like I've kind of lived in this world of like, when I was in high school, there was a lot of talk about it, but it wasn't like everything we talked about, but it was definitely there. But now that I'm like watching these high schoolers and working with these high schoolers and even people my age, it's like the only conversation that's being had is about mental health. And so I've kind of lived in the shift of like not knowing anything about it, feels like we can't talk about it, to now it's like, okay, maybe we don't need this to be the only thing we talk about. And so the shift has been pretty dramatic, I feel like, in my past maybe 10 years of even being aware of those kind of things. And so, yeah, now we're in an interesting place as a society and a world where this is a conversation that's being had pretty much all the time, right? And I don't think it's going away anytime soon. And so maybe the rest of our conversation here on this podcast is let's talk about what do we do with it now as Christ followers, as the church. How do we approach this conversation? I think I've heard people talk about what happened at the 2020 Olympics. I don't know if you guys remember that. Was a big shift and COVID played a big role too, which we'll talk about. But what happened in the 2020 Olympics was Simone Biles. You guys remember that? Where she pulled out of the Olympics for mental health reasons.
Right.
And, there was a lot surrounding her. She was going to dominate every event she was in because she's top of the game. And she pulled out before one of the big events and didn't come back for the rest of the Olympics. And people have talked about that being a pretty decisive moment in the mental health conversation. Of there was a lot of awareness from that because Olympics is a very public, big global event, and there was this very public figure that made this decision and kind of just came out and said, for mental health reasons, I can't do this. And people's reaction to that event said a lot about them. You saw people who were like, oh, this is awesome. I wish I had the courage to do that, or I've never seen this done. I'm going to do that in my own way, whatever. Or you saw people like, oh, she's lost it. She's crazy. She's stupid. She's blowing her career, whatever. And so I don't know how much that was only a couple years ago, but it feels long ago. But I don't know if you guys remember kind of seeing that, but people have talked about that being a very public indication of like, oh, this mental health conversation is going to get a lot bigger. And then from there, I think it's just exploded. There's, artists and musicians that'll cancel world tours the night before they start or a couple shows in because they can't take it. There's all these kinds of things that you see of people kind of saying, oh, I can't do this because of mental health reasons. And it's an interesting spot that we're in. So I don't know if you guys remember that Olympics moment and what your reaction was to it, but that could be an interesting way for us to kind of talk about the shift maybe.
I remember it. I remember being shocked by it. I mean, was the top gymnast going into it. So I do remember being shocked by it. I don't remember what the specific mental illness was. Was it?
You just said mental health reasons. I think she was just overwhelmed and had a lot of stress and anxiety and just pulled out.
I think it was like actually to the point it was affecting her performance. Like
she
knew that she couldn't do a certain thing because her mind.
It's all she could think about.
It was all And I sports psychologists are like that's a huge thing right now.
Yeah.
If Ted Lasso turned all their entire team around. So.
Well, I do think, when you're an Olympic athlete, there's so much pressure to perform, and the training is so intense, and there's so much. Certain things that happen in life push people more toward having mental illness issues, right? There are things that you can do career-wise, activity-wise, that can increase the probability of having mental health problems, right? But some people pressure can cause that. Like you said, we were going to talk about COVID. I was just reading about how, and I'm going to ask you this, but I think students have mental health issues at a higher rate than adults. Do you think high schoolers? But they said that COVID especially elevated that for high schoolers because of not being at school with their friends and being online. All of that. I think that is just an under-discussed probably issue. But to your point, are we discussing these things too much? Have we made it, I guess the question is, have we made it such a easy conversation and a prevalent conversation that now people are claiming it that are just stressed? We're just having some stress. So I have anxiety, I have depression, I can't do what I should do. Can we go too far with it? Is that a question?
I'd say yeah.
I want to be careful saying that because I'm not trying.
Exactly. You gotta be careful.
I want to be very sensitive because I don't know every person's, like you said, chemistry and other things. But I do think it can be a bandwagon thing sometimes.
Especially when we medicate people,
right.
I think, right? Like that's the big thing. Like I was talking about with ADD and ADHD earlier. It's like any kid that has any kind of temperamental attitude or whatever isn't, they're like, oh, hey, let's give them some stimulants and see what happens here. But I think the same could be said for any of the things that you just said, like, mild depression, anxiety, things that everybody faces. Like if maybe you have one bout of anxiety one day, it was like, oh, well, suddenly that defines you as a person. I think that we got to be careful there and say, what can we easily, maybe not easily, but what can we get past with some, general counseling advice, and what can't we get through without actual clinical help?
Because who of us hasn't, I don't know, I should speak for me, but I have felt depressed at times. Different things happening can make you feel depressed. That doesn't mean I have depression, right? We're not here as doctors or psychologists, counselors, but there's feelings you can have, and then there's living in them, right? And how long they last and where they lead to. I mean, there's just so many different levels of this and levels of severity.
Well, depression is, depression is a chemical thing, right? Like we all struggle with it from time to time. It's not like
extreme sadness.
Nobody is exempt from certain, it's life. We call it life, right? We call it living. We're all going to face things in life that disappoint us, and we're all going to be pressured by the outside weight of the world. And so how do we deal with those things? Do we let them overcome us, or do we fight back? And I think that sometimes people have higher capability to fight back, and then some people just don't. Mm-hmm. And those are the people that need the extra care.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the unpopular side of this conversation, like you said, I'm nervous saying it, like it can become a cop-out, right? The mental health conversation can become just like an excuse to maybe not push yourself or not try new things or not, learn and grow through times of stress, which, like you said, we just call it life. So I think as we talk about a lot of things on this podcast, we find ourselves saying, you have to learn how to hold the tension, right? And I think this is one of the perfect examples of that. We can hold the tension of saying, all of us in this room probably pretty confidently can agree with the fact that the church hasn't handled mental health the best historically, just over the course of time, right? We would all probably say that there were a lot of mistakes made of people who desperately needed help and were told, go pray it away, go do this, go talk to somebody else, I don't know, show up to church, right? Like it just kind of excused it. That has happened, right? And that has caused an overreaction in our society of now people saying, oh, I want nothing to do with the church because maybe they've had an experience or their parents have had an experience of not being helped from a place that was told they could help them, right? So that is a very real thing that is happening, and it continues to happen in our world, is there's people who don't go to church because they have had those experiences of, I was super depressed, or I did have these things going on, and I went to my pastor or youth pastor or leader, this person that I thought could solve it for me, which is a whole other conversation, and I was told to just, excuse it away, ignore it, go do these things, and now I don't want anything to do with Jesus, right? That's a very real issue. That's what's happening. So that's a tension that we do have to hold and acknowledge. And at the same time, we can hold and acknowledge the fact that if you allow this to be your entire personality, and you do allow mental health and the mental illness world to become your God, okay, that's not a good place to be either, right? So we've got to kind of be in this tension, this in-between of Jesus is more than enough, right? Anything is possible with God. God can change things that no human medication, doctor, advice can possibly change, right? There is things that happen there, and we need to believe that and walk in that above everything else. And at the same time, there are times and cases and things where you need professional help, and you do need those things that medical advice and counseling and sometimes even medication can help with, right? And I think the better the church gets at doing both of those things well and being able to talk about both those things well, I think is really important to this conversation.
I remember a few years ago hearing Craig Groeschel talk about it on his leadership podcast, and I think what he was doing was really helping people with that stigma. But when we think of it as, I'm sick, so I need to go to a doctor, but sometimes we go to the doctor regularly just for a checkup. And he talked about how he monthly sees a counselor just for his mental health. And he has 1 hour or whatever meeting every month. And it is one of the best things that he does. He talks about everything confidentially going on in his heart and mind. And it really helps him to stay healthy. And I think that's like I think something we don't talk about enough either is not that everybody needs to see a counselor. And then we're not saying there's not enough counselors out there to handle that load if everybody went. But I do think there's some value to that for sure. And you don't have to get to the point where you're suicidal before you see somebody. You're dealing with some things. If you come and talk to one of us on staff here, we're going to say, hey, we'll talk to you for now. But we're going to say, hey, you need to go see this counselor. We're going to make some recommendations. I have a pastor friend who just left being a pastor because over the last year he just felt that burden to be a counselor. He loves it. So that was a thing that he wanted to do, got all the training, got the degrees, and now as a Christian counselor rather than being a pastor, because that's his heart. And there's not enough. I mean, like the workload for people that go into that. And we were just talking about my LCN group about, and Liberty has a great program for training counselors. There's a lot of Christian colleges that do this, but the need, like if you want to go into that field, man, there's so much need for people to give Christian counseling. And I think the stigma is going away in that, but
yeah, I have some insight on that exact topic about like the lack of mental health professionals. And I read this book last month. I forget the name of it, but somewhere along the title is like a comprehensive guide to like mental health issues in adolescence or something like that. But it was talking specifically about the history of mental health and why we don't have enough, why mental health professionals cannot keep up with demand. And there's this paragraph that gave some insight and thought it was really interesting. And I'm not going to read this word for word, but it says, I took a picture of it this morning because I knew we were having this conversation, and I remembered how awesome this was as far as interesting. But it says prior to the 17th century, so not too long ago, but also, hundreds of years ago, children were not generally considered deserving of basic human rights. So they're not full, they don't have, almost kind of how we view adolescents today is, under 17, 18, their brain's not fully developed. They don't need to have the right to do this and that and the other. It goes on to say, so before the 17th and 18th centuries, this is crazy, by the way, this is fact. It's estimated that up to 70% of children died before reaching 5 years of age. Crazy.
That is staggering, yeah.
In fact, it was not until the mid-1800s in Western societies that all children were presumed to have the right to some level of education and access to health care.
Jeez.
So we can understand why we have a lack of mental health professionals, because obviously it wasn't even studied in the early centuries, because, if they didn't have access to it because they weren't, who knew if they were going to survive past the age of 5, So as the years have gone on, the problem has grown and grown and grown, but because of the way that children were viewed and almost still are viewed today, it's like, we'll deal with it when they're older, or that we'll deal with it when their brain is fully developed. What we come to find out through modern medicine is a lot of this is actual brain development issues. It's funny, I was listening to, I think it was John Christ actually, they were talking about Starbucks versus churches or something. I was like, I don't know, maybe this wasn't John Christ, but somebody asked the question, he's like, do you know how many Starbucks there are in America? And he was like, I don't know, couple thousand. It's like 15,000. You know how many churches there are in America? 400,000 churches in America. And you know what's crazy? As pastors are by definition counselors. So you should have 400,000 counselors ready to go to minister to those that need mental health counseling. I think that there's something to be said about referring people to professional clinical counseling, but I think that that's not the end all. I would say that if somebody comes to us and says, "Hey, I'm struggling with this," and they are clinically diagnosed on, based off of whatever scale is being used, we refer them to a licensed professional, but we are still their main point of contact through all of that, right? Yeah. Because as we know, the clinical world and what they define kind of goes against a lot of what we believe as far as, the way we were developed, how we were created, what we were created for, what our actual identity is. And we know, now, unfortunately, you can identify as whatever you want. So maybe a clinical psychologist might tell somebody, "Oh, you're fine just the way you are. That's who you are." And we know that we're created with a God-given identity. But I just think that kind of ties some perspective into those two problems we're talking about. Is like, why we have this crisis now, and why isn't the church stepping up? I think it's a lot of it comes because I think pastors don't realize that that's by very definition of providing pastoral care and caring for your flock is being a counselor and talking truth and wisdom into people's life. And not only that, but like walking beside them in life and grieving with them, which I think we don't do enough of. So those are just some initial thoughts there really to kind of tie those two points together.
Like it shows us too how young in a lot of ways this topic is of mental health in the church, especially with adolescents, which we're kind of talking about. It shows you how young that the studies that are and how young all this stuff is, because it's like it's 17th, 18th century, right? This stuff wasn't even thought of. It was just beginning to be like, oh yeah, they could have healthcare, right? So like obviously hundreds of years down the road, now we're starting to be like, oh, they actually need more, right? And so that's really interesting.
I've just been doing a lot of reading of this stuff for some educational purposes, but the scale that like defines a lot of these mental health issues that we use, that clinical psychologists and mental health professionals use, a lot of people that are listening to this podcast will have heard of the DSM-5. You've probably read a little bit about this, but there's been multiple iterations of this scale that people use, and it's updated. Like it gets updated all the time. Like 2010, it's updated with like, this is actually what ADHD is, it's because of the lack of research's funding and resources. It's like we've had no knowledge of it until it became a crisis. And now it's like, we don't actually know what these mental health problems are. Yeah.
Are we creating more mental health problems in our society because of our technology? Has that made it, obviously it's made it worse, like for students, right? Do you think there's more mental illness because of social media and all of that?
Yeah, Mitch, this is your cup of tea.
So I was just about to bring this up in some of the stuff I've been doing for the series that we're in at the Well right now. The world at large and the psychology world is scrambling right now, post-COVID, what is happening to developmentally the brains of adolescents and young adults. Like it's scaring these, scientists and professors and psychology, like all this stuff, because like there's no way to have predicted it, right? That's the other thing too, is you can point fingers all day long at, the Facebooks and all this stuff. There's no way, nobody could have predicted that we'd be where we are now. And COVID fueled it all. I really do believe that. Quarantine and people being home and students being forced to be away from people for extended periods of time, like a lot of that just elevated what was already there. And they were kind of forced to rely on fake forms of interaction and, screens and entertainment. And it is, this past week, 2 weeks ago, I got up on Sunday night, and my first 5 minutes of my message, all I did, no context whatsoever, I wrote the top 15 signs and symptoms of addiction according to Psychology Today. And then what we did, and we worked through them based on how students treat their phones, and all 15 are evident in most students' lives. And all I did was just generic, what they have listed on their website is signs and symptoms of addiction. I got up and read that list, and then we started to talk through the fact that that's how we act with social media and technology.
Probably some of the adult leaders there too were probably like,
I was reading them like, oh crap. Yeah. But like it's there is so much happening, more than it's above my pay grade to sit here and say what's happening to students' brains and mental health when it comes with that, in terms of being addicted to and being able to have the world at your fingertips. Like, I think you were referencing Joe Rogan recently was talking about how we weren't designed to look on the lives of other people the way that we do now because of social media and technology. Those effects of just like playing God in a way, it's just destroying. And I am not I have every social media, like I'm not any of those things, but I think harsh lines do have to be drawn when it comes to technology and social media, because I don't think we were designed to be exposed to the things that we're exposed to. And I think it is fueling a lot of the things that we're feeling and dealing with, even us in this room. I mean, we can say students all day long, but it's us and it's adults too. Like, I think some of this stuff just needs to be reevaluated from a Christ follower point of view of like, oh, I'm not supposed to watch this TV show that everybody's talking about that has X, Y, and Z in it. Oh, I'm not supposed to, be able to get on my phone and click 2 buttons and shop and buy whatever I want. Like that actually just feeds my shopping addiction. Like all of this stuff is just being fueled. And like I said, I think the world is beginning, there's a ton of study that's being done on digital addiction and the outcomes of it. And all these, Psychology Today and these big organizations that are secular, quote unquote, not church related, are scrambling and freaking out because we're the most connected the world has ever been. And if you're listening, I put up quotes for that. But anxiety, depression, and suicide are skyrocketing. And it's a little bit scary. It's a little bit scary to think about the fact that a lot of what we have in terms of technology and social media is a miracle, and it's awesome, and the really cool tools and resources that we can use to do a lot of good. But we have to talk about the other side too, that it is fueling and adding to this issue of mental health. And I think the outcomes are going to be worse and worse. I've said this to students when I've counseled them one-on-one, and I'll say it forever. I think pornography alone is destroying an entire generation of men. And I think by the time the students now are adults, we're going to see a lot of issues that just continue to come up in terms of marriage rates and divorce rates and intimacy and all these different things. I think so much of this conversation is just it gets me heated, because I think the more you stop and you look at how maybe we were designed to live and how we're living now and how God wants us to live and all these different things, you just go, we've got to make some shifts, because there's some things happening, especially in the brains of adolescents, that I think is really dangerous and not something we should be playing with.
Yeah, I've kind of got a question for you as somebody with you have a wider perspective on this, because me and Mitch both grew up in the digital age, like hardcore, we had internet. I had internet in my house as a teenager, though it was dial up and you had to put a floppy disk into the thing right, and go through the AOL boot up, But I saw something interesting the other day about how testosterone levels in men are 15 times lower than they were even, I think, like 20 years ago or something like that. And a lot of that people attribute to just the fact that we sit at a desk all day staring at a screen inside with no physical movement, no sunlight, no social interaction. We're not doing anything with our bodies to move, to relieve stress, pressures. And we're just shells of a person sitting. And I think, and even more so now after COVID, it's like, oh, we can work from, pretty much anybody can work from home, right? Yeah. Unless you're like in the trades or you're, working construction, something like that. Yeah. So I was just wondering, like, have you seen that like firsthand? Have you been able to even like maybe feel that yourself, or have you noticed it in people, just the lack of like, I guess, being able to cope with that, because I feel it myself. Like if I'm working a lot at my computer one day, I'm like, I just got to get up and go walk around. Like I need to go see the sun. And here in Ohio, obviously, we know depression has a lot to do with the environment that you're in, not being able to feel sunlight and soak up that vitamin D and things like that. How do you feel as a I
don't know. That's a tough question. I do think there is a lot more mental illness today because of what we do, the way we live our lives behind screens. I mean, everything that you're saying, Mitch is saying, when I grew up, it wasn't like we all had computers in our homes. We didn't have, it was like only a few people could have one. When you did get one, it wasn't something you would sit and look at, because all it was a word processor. It wasn't not the internet. And so the internet has changed so much, and there's so much good, and then there's so much bad, and we're kind of going down that road. I'm not really sure, and the question's so broad. I'm not sure what you're.
Well,
just
like
your perspective.
For you personally, growing up, for you, things you did for fun, things you did when there was nothing to do. That
outside,
and now think about you have a sophomore in high school, right?
Right.
Think about how he spends his free time, what he does when he's bored, right? Things he runs to when he's whatever. And then just like, I think it'd be interesting for you to talk about the difference between the two.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good way to frame it. Yeah, I mean, like he has, a PlayStation and is online gaming with his friends. And that's his biggest recreational activity. Thankfully, he's an athlete and he plays baseball and he has scheduled workouts and all of that keeps him active and physically in shape and all. But I mean, we didn't have that. So when I was his age, it would have been the same physical activity, but then just more of it. Maybe watch a TV show with my parents because we didn't have TVs all over the house with apps. It would be something that was on regular TV, live TV. But it wasn't we wouldn't binge on shows like we do today. Sorry about my voice. We wouldn't binge like that and just get, so like for him, when he's not doing baseball, it's either binging on a show in his room or binging on playing PlayStation with his friends and we would be outside more. Like I just like feel that, like you said, it's so cold in January, but like even yesterday, it was up low 40s. I said to Sherry, let's go out and take a walk after dinner. She was like, I'm going to go to the treadmill. I was like, let's go outside. Even though it's cold, still, let's go and do a 2-mile walk. And it just like there's something that changes in your brain. It's like I know it, but yet I don't do it enough. But there's something that changes in your brain. Like you're saying here, sometimes sitting in the desk all day, it just a lot of people have those jobs, not everybody, but it does. I mean, it does impact you. People have always had desk jobs in the past too.
Yeah, but generally before the internet age, you had desk jobs, but a lot of them were in the same room with 15 to 20 other people, and then you had meetings that you had to go to, and there's something to be said about being physically in the presence of people. I mean, we talk about that as in the when we try to tell people to come to church rather than just watching it online, like being with people. And physically,
right? The work from home dynamic, I think, is great for a lot of people, and it's a nice thing that we can do when we need to for us. But if we tried to do that all the time, I think I don't think that we're wired that way. I mean, all three of us, like, hey, I don't mind a day here or there like that. It's nice because you can get more done, less interruption. But I think we look forward to interruptions here. Like we like the conversations because that's good for our mental health. I mean, and I think, sometimes when Sherry and I will sit down to watch a show that we're watching, we'll have something to talk about and we'll pause it and we'll talk for an hour instead of watching another episode. And that's like way more fulfilling in our lives than it is watching that next episode of whatever it is that we're watching. Right. And I think that I've been in those situations with, plenty of people where it's like we were going to do something, watch something, and then we started talking and it's like, this is great. And I think that to me is the biggest difference from when I was a kid to my 15-year-old son, who's a sophomore as a kid, is face-to-face talking and hanging out rather than online.
Yeah, and that's what I think causes a lot of struggle in teens, Mitch, is like kids just don't know how to interact with each other. And so whenever they're forced to do it, it causes so many issues because they're like, I can't just text this, or, like they realize there's a lot more emotion behind, communication than just words.
Like, and that's a big one too. I think that texting our conversations has been, is a detriment. I think there's times when that's nice and it's appropriate and it's good to be articulate in that way, but you don't see the person's face and that causes all kinds of feelings that aren't even there, perhaps because you read into things, but that is the way that the younger generations do more so. But I think it's a dangerous thing to do. So,
yeah. I mean, I think that it's, like I said, I grew up in the digital age for the most part, and so but at the same time, I remember spending so much of my teenage years like outside building ramps, like bike ramps and things like that, with the neighborhood kids, and drinking from the garden hose when, but like I think of my kids now, like when their screen time is up for the day and they don't have any more TV time or tablet time because they have an allocated time, they don't know what to do with themselves. Like, it's like, okay, well, so that a lot of times it's like our oldest Audrey, like sometimes she'll just sit there on the couch like, okay, well, when what now? Like what I feel like for a lot of people, and it's going to only get worse and worse and worse, especially with things like virtual reality and augmented reality. People are going to get to the end of their life and be like, I wasted how much time watching that TV show? Like when we watch TV, and I'm just as guilty as anybody else. When we binge these things and spend 2 or 3 hours every night watching TV, that is nothing but wasted time. Like it's not doing anything for us in any way, other than providing maybe a short conversation topic for the next day at lunch, right? So I just it's a tough time to live in because of those things. And
you said we couldn't have predicted this. You said that. What do you have any idea if we have the same conversation 10 years from now, what it's going to be like?
There's no way to know.
I know.
We're all going to have goggles on though.
But I think so. Like, what I think about is the fact that I'm 24. My whole life has been digital and online, and that's been available my entire life. But I have to nod to my parents in that way because I didn't get a phone till I was a sophomore in high school. Like we had one computer in our house. I wasn't allowed to have a TV in my room until I was in high school. Like, yes, it was very digital, and I had access to a lot of these different kinds of things. My parents were very strict about when and what age we were allowed to do that kind of stuff, and I do think it protected me in a lot of ways, as a lot of maybe compared to some other people my age didn't have that. They were allowed to just go do whatever they wanted, and they had phones in 4th grade, and they were watching whatever movies they wanted. And I was mad at my parents at times, like, it's PG-13, I can't watch, like, but they were very strict about what we were allowed to do digitally, even though it was available to me growing up. I mean, like, the iPhone came out when I was 7 years old. Like, it was available. But but they did a really, really good job of protecting me in that way. And now that I have a daughter who'll be 1 this week, and I'm just thinking about, like, as the world gets more and more digital, there are still ways to protect ourselves and our kids from these things, because it really does come down to discipline and what lines you do draw. And you might be unpopular, but maybe you don't have TVs in bedrooms, and I don't know, just these kind of things. And I feel like this conversation could go on forever, so I think we maybe need to begin to land it. But I find this stuff super interesting, just because I think more and more, it's funny, at 24, where I should not be maybe thinking some of these ways, more and more I'm like drawing lines with social media and technology, and I don't want to be a part of some of the things that maybe the world is telling me I should be a part of, which is interesting.
It is interesting, and I wonder if there will be a shift. It sounds crazy to say it, but I wonder if there will be a shift away from so many apps on our phones, so many social medias that we're in, Instagram and Facebook and Snapchat and Twitter and everything that we're doing. I wonder if there'll be a shift where people just realize how bad it is for them, and they'll start doing less.
You think that's why things like, or this may be random and not make any sense at all when I say it, but do you think that's why like pickleball took off as a sport? It was because anybody from any age could play. It doesn't require a lot of training. And people realized you could just go out on a tennis court randomly and have so much fun with a couple other people face to face, and not, it has nothing to do with technology.
Yeah.
You're moving your body around, you're getting sunlight, you're conversating with other people, and it, as maybe coincidentally, just exploded as a not necessarily as a sport, but as a leisure activity.
Yeah. I think that's a piece of it. And also too, there's a sense of real community that you get to be a part of. Like, when you go out and play, even at the Pickerington courts or whatever, there's not a day you go and there's not other people that you're like, hey, how's it going? What's going on? And they're talking about, like, it is kind of a funny, maybe example, but like, and I know that, I've gotten really into pickleball over the past couple of years, but like, yeah, like 100%, it's this like, oh, I get to be outside for a couple hours and I can play with somebody who has never played before and still have fun, or I can go out there with people that are very intense and playing a league, like and it's all fun and enjoyable, and it's just something to connect over that's like real and not just, sitting behind a screen or whatever. And yeah, I mean, that's a good example, I think.
I've got a interesting way maybe we can land this plane, if you will, to kind of talk about the church's role in all of this. I had to do a project not too long ago where I sat down with a with somebody struggling with addiction and ask them a series of questions. And one of the questions that stuck with me was I asked, how can the church support addicts better? How can the church support those struggling with mental health problems better? And the answer wrecked me. Essentially, it was the church should just stay out of it, because those in the church are so focused solely on the spiritual aspect of things, like you were saying earlier. Like, let's get them in church. Let's we'll witness to them and then get them out of here. The church doesn't understand what they're dealing with. And the church doesn't want to understand what they're dealing with. They just want them to be fixed.
Quick fix.
Yeah. And or the church wants them to get out of their face and just go find somebody that's trained to do it professionally, clinically. How do you feel about that? Like that really stuck with me, because I get it. Like, I understand where he's coming from in that.
For sure.
Like, because for the longest time, even with something like addiction, like, for a lot of us in our perspective, we're like, why don't you just stop? Why don't you just stop doing that? Well, there's a lot more to it than that. And that's kind of the viewpoint in a nutshell from the lens of a lot of churches, is like, just fix it. Like, what's wrong with you?
We're doing a series on it. In 3 weeks, you'll figure it out.
Yeah. So I wonder, like, officially, like, I guess, Steve, from your viewpoint as, the pastor of Sycamore Creek, like, where should that importance lie, and where should that lead us in the future? Like, should this be something that we should be focusing on more? I feel like you'll say yes, of course, but, like, what does that look like?
Well, I go back to what are we here? What is the calling of the church? What is the purpose of the church? I mean, and you can go down these roads of, do you just say, what is everybody struggling with, and let's just preach on those things? Or should we make sure we're preaching the word of God and hitting the things as they come? So there's, like, a lot of different approaches to that, and you can always just talk about felt needs. But if you do that, if statistics are true, then we would be talking about mental health probably every week. And then that would probably be going too far, swinging the other way. Like you said, I would say we probably don't talk about it enough. But we don't want to be the church that is always doing series after series on that. I do believe, though, I don't think it's about, this is just my reaction, I don't think it's about we need to do more series on this topic. I think we need to talk about it more as it comes up in every type of series and any type of passage in the Bible. We're doing summer in the Psalms this year. David had mental health issues. I mean, David, we're going to be reading his Psalms. It doesn't take much to figure that out, that he struggled. With no technology, with mental health. There was others in the Bible that actually said they were depressed and wanted to die. I don't think we know all the story of all of that. But I'm just saying that we have opportunities to talk about it. We don't talk about it probably as much as we should as opportunities arise. I don't think we should. Let's make sure we do a series every fall and every spring on mental health. But I think we need to talk about it as it comes up, because it is absolutely a part of our lives. And I do think going forward, we just need to be careful that we are attentive to it, but that we don't talk in an area that's out of our depth, where we're like, I'm just going to say some random things and throw out some statistics. Of course, everybody's heard those. How does that help me? But I do think I feel guilty in the whole, like you said, I don't know what the right way is, of just, I just want to refer people because I don't want to deal with it.
It's tough,
yeah. It's tough because you have to figure out if this person's, how severe is this? Is it something that they just need to be discipled and matched up with somebody that can walk with them through that? Or do they really need to go see somebody professional? Because that's the easy answer, but that's not always, like, some things maybe don't need that. Maybe they need both. And so I feel like overwhelmed by it in a sense that we're never going to be able to do enough. I don't think we're equipped. We'd almost need, like, a staff member dedicated to that one thing, and that still wouldn't be enough. Like, it's an overwhelming type of question.
The church as a whole, like, not just our church,
not
like
just Sycamore.
Like, we have to do something, but, like, the church as a whole needs to change the mindset of what it means to shepherd and pastor and counsel. It's not so much getting up and preaching and leading doing all the business side of everything, right? Like,
and I do think something that just I was thinking about it and what Mitch is doing with students. And I think you think about doctors and preventative care. I think that's where we can really do a better job, because he's talking about preventative care so that you're not in the hospital, right? And we talk about that when it comes to exercise, eating healthy, taking care of your body physically so you don't end up with all these problems as you get older. What about our mental health? And that's where I think we need to, because I think by the time they get to needing counseling, okay, they need counseling. They need medication. They might need something. They need some professional help that's above our pay grade. But if we can do our part, we can help people, I think, do a better job of getting to that point.
And at the end of the day, that's most of the people that are coming into the church for the first time new are people that like, oh, I need help, right?
I need it.
Yeah.
I need preventative care in my own heart and life. And you just said earlier that you do too. And I mean, all three of us.
I don't.
You don't.
Good.
Well, I know you've got it figured out already. I will tell you this: you do probably a better job than we do of shutting down and blocking, like turning your phone down. I know what's that new tool you got?
Don't get me started. I love it.
Okay, is that too much of a rabbit trail?
Yeah, it's called The Brick. You can look it up.
Anyway, just the idea of it. And then maybe, and I think too, just we're talking about our children. I'm like, I worry and pray for my grandchildren, and I'm glad I'm not having to raise my kids in the next 20 years. Like, man, it was hard enough with what they were facing. And you guys with young children, you're going to have even more challenges than in different ways, different challenges. And I think, man, I want to support and I want to be educated well enough to, I can help people to prevent things before they get to the point of breakdowns. But
I think one thing I've been thinking about a lot, my maybe closing thing on this conversation's too big that we're not going to wrap it up in a pretty bow and everybody's going to walk out of here like, man, this is great. But hopefully just us starting this conversation and being vulnerable about this conversation has helped somebody listening or watching. But one thing that I've been thinking about a ton, and I know the word is like gets thrown around so much in the mental health culture, but I think a holistic approach to church and to how we preach and teach, I think, is really helpful. I mean, like, think about everything that you go through. You approach it as a whole person, right? Physically, mentally, spiritually, you come to everything that you do. And I think the church could do a better job of just evaluating the things that we do preach and teach on from those different aspects. Like, I don't know about you guys, but for me, like, when I'm at a really good place spiritually, like, and usually physically, and usually, mentally, they all kind of follow suit. And then I kind of just find myself in this better position all around where maybe I'm a little bit more disciplined. I'm just like, everything just starts to flow, right? I mean, God designed us as whole people. It's not like, hey, you're going to keep your spiritual life in this bucket and your physical life over here, and then your mental health, and we'll brush that under the rug. Maybe talk about that at some point. Like, it's all of you. God designed all of you physically, mentally, spiritually. And I think the more that the church does of finding language and finding ways to talk to all three of those parts of us, I think is really helpful, right? When I can talk about, maybe a character from the Bible and relate it to my life physically, mentally, spiritually, in these different buckets and ways to live. Like, for me at least, that's a really helpful approach to some of this stuff, is because it translates maybe way more than we think, and maybe way more than the church has thought.
I think studies have actually shown that.
Yeah.
If you're physically healthy, it does help your mental health and the spiritual side of it. So to go all the way back to the beginning, some of those things that those old pastors said, there's some truth in, like a person that is like, I'm just struggling with all these mental health issues. Like, if you're not reading your Bible and praying at all, well, you're not helping yourself with those things that are obviously, that doesn't mean that's the fix all and that's going to solve all your problems, but that is a piece. And we're part of that. And we don't want to be, like you said, we want to be holistic. We don't just say, well, we'll just tell you the spiritual thing and you do with it.
Figure the rest out. Yeah.
You figure the rest out. We care about you as a whole person, just like God does.
Yeah.
Yes.
Any more thoughts over there?
Got more, but we need to wrap
this
this up.
could go on for. This could be
I know. My mind
record.
keeps going different places. I'm like, no, that's not. We can't do that right now. Well, thank you so much for listening, watching this conversation. I'm sure there will be a part 2 in some fashion over the next couple of months, because I can just feel that we've got more things to say and want to talk about. So hopefully, stay tuned for that. If this was terrible, tell us not to do it. We'll listen. But as always, let us know what topics, ideas, questions, conversations you want to hear, and we'll be back next week on the In All Things podcast. Have a great week. Bye. thank you so much for listening to this episode of the In All Things podcast. Our challenge for you today is to send this episode to one person. Seriously, think of somebody right now that could use this conversation and send it to them. If you have any questions, feedback, or topic ideas, please send them to podcast@sycamorecreek.org, and make sure you follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Sycamore Creek Church so that you can always see what's going on in our world. If this conversation helped you at all, make sure you share it, leave a review, and subscribe so that you don't miss out on a single episode. We love you, God loves you, and we'll see you next week on the In All Things podcast.